I'm very pleased and honored to be speaking this afternoon. I nearly said this evening because we're so used to doing these in the evening. Can't see it here, but the sun is still shining here and it's a nice summer afternoon. And I want to take you on a rather selective journey, a stroll through Jewish Hannover, past and present. I'm not going to make any attempt to give an exhaustive account of the last 700 years of Jewish life in Hanover. I'm going to pick and choose selectively highlights and important aspects, important personalities. And the talk is centered around individuals who shaped Hanover city and society in the realms of industry, science, and the arts, and who were members of the Jewish community. And I'd like to start with a quote from the Statutes of Hanover Town Council in the 14th century, 1303, nearly 800 years ago. "No one shall injure the Jews either in word or deed." This is a very nice statement coming from a city council in the Middle Ages in Germany. Unfortunately, the statement was not something that was adhered to particularly strictly over the years, over the centuries. Within 200 years of this statement being written down in the town council statutes, Jews began to be expelled from the town. The town at the time was a very small town, not the big city of Hanover today. And for you to understand what I'm talking about for the next 3/4 of an hour or so, it will be a good idea to have a look at the plan that you can see here behind the quote, and perhaps to remember that the city of Hanover consisted of an old town, which was the historic core of the town, a new town, which was developed in the centuries afterwards, in the late Middle Ages and early modern times, and the village of Linden, which was integrated into the city in 1920, but was very important for the development of industry in Hanover in the 19th century, when it was still an independent village. And when in the early centuries that we're talking about a city that consists of the old town, then the new town is added, and then Linden begins to develop. In 1609, the very first synagogue was erected in the town of Hanover. It's difficult to locate it exactly, and it didn't last very long. It was closed and demolished within a year or so, following protests from the residents of the city. About 50 years before, the very first Jewish cemetery was opened in Hanover, or rather outside the town. This is unlike the practice of Christian burial, which up to the 17th century took place on the churchyards, right beside the churches in the center of settlements. The first Jewish cemetery in Hanover was outside of the city, or outside of the town. And this is not only the oldest piece of Jewish heritage and culture in Hanover, it's also the oldest surviving piece of Jewish culture and heritage in Hanover. This is a photograph of the cemetery from the 1960s or 70s. And it's still there today and can still be visited today. The first Jewish individual from Hanover that we're going to look at more closely is a gentleman from the late 17th and early 18th century, Lefman Behrens. Lefman Behrens was a court factor, which is an earlier form of the banking trade. He was a financier to the House of Hanover, to the Habsburgs, to the Hohenzollerns, and other German royal houses. And he helped to fund the elevation of the Hanoverian dukes, for example, to the status of elector in 1692 and to royal status in 1701. So he was an example of what some of you may have heard of as court Jews, Jews who were closely associated with royal or ruling families. And while he himself was not a very powerful person in the general state of things, he used his closeness to political power to further the concerns of the Jewish community in Hanover. So Lefman Behrens was the individual whom Hanover has to thank for the erection of the first lasting synagogue in the town. And the synagogue was erected in the new town outside the old town. You can see here the blue circle marks the location. Here we can zoom in and see the layout of the plot. There's one building fronting onto the street, which was a community building, and the synagogue itself is hidden from public view in the yard behind the main building. And this situation continued right into the 19th century. It was typical of many synagogues in German towns, and today it is typical of a different community in German towns. Many mosques in German towns are today situated in backyards, the way synagogues were in the 18th and 19th century. The first synagogue that was built in the 18th century in 1704 didn't last for much longer than 100 years. It was then remodeled and rebuilt. And the only images we have are from this remodeled synagogue from the early 19th century. And this is what it looked like inside. And because it was hidden away in a backyard, there are no pictures available of the facade of the synagogue. We don't know if it had an imposing facade or if it was merely a functional building. This is what the building in front of it looked like. This is what everybody saw who came to synagogue. They went through the large door here on the ground floor and through the front building and across the yard into the actual synagogue. Lefman Behrens, I already mentioned that he was closely involved with the Royal House of Hanover. And in 1704, he was instrumental in setting up a religious dispute. This was something which was quite popular in the late 18th and early 19th century late 17th and early 18th century in Germany. Hanover is not unique in this, that a representative of Christianity would hold a public debate with a representative of Judaism in an attempt. It's difficult to know what exactly they wanted, whether they were trying to demonstrate their Enlightenment tolerance or trying to demonstrate the superiority of Christian argument. In the case of the dispute in Hanover, Lefman Behrens and Rabbi Aaron Abterode summoned a rabbi from a small town outside Hanover, Josef Samson Stadthagen, from the town of Stadthagen, to Hanover to take part in a religious dispute with a convert called Aaron Margalita. And the host of this dispute was the elector's mother, Sophie. And this is a lady whose genealogy was provided the connection with the English royal house. And her son, Elector Georg Ludwig, was also present at the debate. And this Elector Georg Ludwig was later King George I of England, maybe more familiar to many of you in this guise. The dispute took place in the royal palace in the town center. This is how it would have looked at the time before it was rebuilt. The palace we know today in Hanover looks quite different. And Lefman Behrens, Samson Stadthagen argued very eloquently and very intelligently. And at the end of the debate, the electress mother, Sophie, made a very typical Enlightenment sort of statement about the equality of religions. But Samson Stadthagen's own summing up of the debate is a little bit more realistic. He quoted from Proverbs, "Thou shalt fear the Lord and the King," which reveals the reality of the position of Jews in an ostensibly tolerant Enlightenment society, but where the Lord in heaven was perhaps not quite as important as the Lord on earth, the King, whom one also had to fear in order to be able to safely worship one's own God. The very first city directory from Hanover is a very interesting document. It was published in 1798, and I'm showing an extract from it here because it shows us that the thinking of the time made a very clear division between Jews and Christians in city society or urban society. The main part of the directory lists the Christian residents of Hanover and their business activities. And at the end, there's a separate part for the Judenschaft, for the members of the Jewish community, who were not permitted to be in the main body of this important document. And you'll see names, surnames such as Abraham, Bendix, Behrens, Berlin, which are for a long time very typical names in the Jewish community in Hanover. I mentioned at this start that the village of Linden is central to the development of industry in Hanover, and some of the biggest industries in Linden owe their origins and their financing and their planning, very foresighted planning, to several Jewish members of Hanover society. One important banker in this respect was Adolf Meyer, and a very 19th century person. We see here his bank building in the old town near the railway station. And in the village of Linden, he planned two of the largest spinning mills in northern Germany. The first one, the Mechanische Weberei, or mechanical mill, was the largest in Germany at the time. The cotton spinning mill next door was also an extremely large business. They employed several thousand people in the mid-19th century. And the interesting thing about these mills is that they used English technology. Adolf Meyer imported English experts to build English spinning machines. And in the case of the cotton spinning mill, the machines were actually integrated into the architecture of the building. They were very modern for the time, very innovative. And as you can see from these 19th century drawings, they were very large. Also typical of 19th century industrialists was the provision of workers' housing, planned workers' housing close to the mills. Adolf Meyer called one of the streets where he built workers' housing Fanny Straße, or Fanny Street, after his wife, whose name was Fanny. One of the earliest incidents of a street in Hanover being called after a Jewish woman. And here you can see what the larger mill looked like before it was destroyed by bombs in the Second World War. You can see it as an extremely dominant and imposing industrial complex that dominated this part of the city and dominated the view along the river for 40, 50, 60, 70 years before it was destroyed. At the same time that the city was expanding and industrializing, its population was growing, and not only was its non-Jewish and Christian population growing, the Jewish population was also growing. The old cemetery that I showed you at the beginning of the lecture was no longer large enough to take new burials, and a new cemetery was opened to the north of the city center, here on the street called Strangriede. You can see there's a large non-Jewish or secular cemetery, Christian cemetery beside it. At this stage, both Christians and Jews are moving out of the city center, looking for new space for large cemeteries to take the growing numbers of dead from a rapidly expanding population. This is the chapel on that cemetery, which is still standing today. And a view of the cemetery itself, which is currently quite overgrown. Some of us find it picturesque, but it's certainly not good for the state of the gravestones. The chapel in the cemetery was built by Edwin Oppler, and Oppler is not just important because he built the cemetery chapel. He's remembered in Hanover for a far more imposing and centrally located building. The synagogue in the back building on Bergstraße became too small for the large community, and the Jewish community was able to buy a site in front of the Bergstraße where a postal building, a mail building had formerly been, that was no longer used. And on this site, a large imposing synagogue was built. And if you look at the map, you can see that right beside the synagogue was a Protestant church, and just around the corner, a large Catholic church. Some people like to cite this as an example of tolerance in Hanover. It wasn't really tolerance, it was simply fortuitous that the buildings happened to be located so closely together. This is an outside view of the synagogue. That was the opening picture in the lecture. An inside view, you can see it was an extremely large and imposing building, and it is remembered by Jews from Hanover who survived the persecution in the 1930s and the Holocaust, who managed to escape or who survived camps. They remember the synagogue as a place that was a place of pride, a place of visible and vibrant Jewish life in the city center. To return to the influence of Jewish Hanoverians on industry in the city, we're coming to somebody from a very humble and modest background. Sigmund Seligmann was born in the small town of Verden, near Bremen, north of Hanover. Came to Hanover as a young banker's clerk. He was a very young man. He was 17 or 18 when he came to the city. He started to work in the bank of Moritz Magnus. And this was a very fortunate choice of job for him, because Moritz Magnus was a member of the consortium that founded the now world famous company of Continental. I'm sure many of you will have Continental tires on your cars if you drive a motor car. And Continental is a Hanoverian firm that was founded in the city in the late 19th century by a consortium of local bankers, many of whom were Jewish. When Sigmund Seligmann started working for Moritz Magnus, Continental was in serious financial difficulties. And Moritz Magnus must have noticed this young cashier as a smart and talented young person, and he gave him the task of looking at the finances of Continental Rubber. And Sigmund Seligmann made numerous recommendations for improving the functioning of the company, and also suggested a large infusion of capital. And he must have been extremely impressive for such a young person, because Moritz Magnus managed to persuade the consortium that this was the way to go. He installed Sigmund Seligmann in the running of the Continental company. And within 10 years or so, Seligmann was the general manager of Continental. And he expanded the fairly modest rubber factory into a huge complex beside the goods railway station, just north of the city centre. Here you can see a contemporary drawing of the complex. Everything you see on this is Continental. They expanded in the late 19th century to other sites in Hanover, and it's still a dominant presence in the industrial landscape of the city. Sigmund Seligmann prospered in his role as manager of a rapidly globalizing industry. He built a representative villa for himself and his family on the edge of the city, beside the city woods. On his death, his widow found that the villa was too troublesome to keep up, too expensive, and the rooms were far too large for a widow to live in on her own. So she gave a present of the villa to the city. It mouldered in city hands for many decades until Andor Ishak revitalized it 20 years ago, and it became the European Center for Jewish Music, which is a function it still has today, and is a new vibrant center of Jewish culture in Hanover, fittingly in a building that has a long Jewish history. Another global company that many of you will be familiar with, Deutsche Grammophon, has roots in Hanover. The Berliner brothers were Hanoverians. Jakob, Emil, and Josef Berliner founded a number of businesses in Hanover. Here you see where they started their telephone factory in the 1870s, just beside the new Jewish cemetery that we saw a few slides ago. And it was here that they developed the now globally known logo, His Master's Voice. They moved their factory to the edge of the city in 1904. The buildings on the edge of the city are still there today, even if they're no longer used by Deutsche Grammophon. But Hanover is not only the seat of global and still famous industries. There were many smaller and medium-sized enterprises which are forgotten today. And surprisingly enough, one of these forgotten enterprises was global in its day. I think none of you, apart from Ursula, will have heard of Molling's Printing Works, just around the corner from where Berliner's telephone factories began. The document beside the map is from a school's atlas that was used to teach children in Hanover about the history and geography of their own city in the early 1900s up to the 1930s. And Molling is beside other better known and more famous firms in this. Here we can see what the factory looked like. Adolf Molling, the founder, was a banker, a fairly small-scale banker who came from Hildesheim, opened a small banking business in the city centre. And for some reason, he must have been observing the developments in colour printing, because at exactly the right time, he bought a site on which he built a large factory and launched himself into the business of colour printing. And from being a small bank with a handful of employees, he became the owner of a large printing works with several hundred employees and with a global reach in terms of their distribution. They printed packaging, for instance, here for cigarettes. Constantin Cigarettes was a large and well-known brand in Germany in the 19th and 20th century for local innovative art organizations such as the Kästner Gesellschaft, for famous firms such as Continental. And the rather warlike postcard that you can see on the right is a wartime advertising postcard for Bars and Biscuits. I'm not sure how their distribution is today in North America and England, but certainly when I was younger, you could buy Bars and Biscuits in Ireland. O'Dole is another firm which is still very well known in Germany, O'Dole mouthwater, and Molling printed the boxes for the original bottles of O'Dole mouthwater in the early 20th century, and a little advertising picture book praising the virtues of O'Dole mouthwater for keeping your teeth nice and your breath fresh. As well as printing advertising and packaging, they also produced picture books which they claimed were available in all languages. So far I've found 9 languages, which isn't bad. They also claimed that their picture books were available globally around the world, worldwide. I certainly have found examples on several continents, including Indonesia, which is fairly impressive. But Molling's printing works were forgotten after the 1930s, after the Jewish owners were forced to sell the works at a low price. The sort of same old story that we hear from so many businesses and so many people's private wealth, and were only rediscovered when I got interested in them and started poking around in archives and online. The congregation was growing all the time with the city, and new infrastructure was being produced in the last quarter of the 19th and early first quarter of the 20th century. A new parish building or community building had to be built on Lützowstraße in 1875. An institution for training Jewish teachers was built on Uhrstraße. A Jewish hospital was built on Ellandstraße, just outside the city centre. And a Jewish orphanage was installed in an existing building in the south part of the city, Emmerberge. All of these buildings were used in the 1930s as so-called Judenhäuser or ghetto houses to concentrate the Jewish population of Hanover, so that many people who survived that time remember these buildings in a not so pleasant way. Another important Jewish institution in Hanover was the horticultural school in Ahlem, founded by the Hanover banker Moritz Simon. Moritz Simon had an interesting motivation in founding his horticultural school. Here we see a postcard of the school printed coincidentally by Adolf Molling's printing works. Moritz Simon saw that there was rampant anti-Semitism in German society in the late 19th century. And he had the idea that part of this might be due to the fact that Germans felt they could see Jews in stereotypical professions such as banking, the development of department stores, development of large industries, Jews in professions associated with the concentration of money and capital and property. And Moritz Simon had the idea that if you could change the distribution of Jewish occupations in German society, if you could expand the interest of young Jews in new trades, new professions that had in many cases not been used or not been taken up by young Jewish people because they were forbidden to them for many centuries, Moritz Simon had the idea that if you could put young Jews into horticulture, into agriculture, into trades such as carpentry or building, that the perception of Jews in German society could thereby be changed by Jews themselves. So he established a large and for many decades successful horticultural school in Ahlem, which is a village just outside Hanover to the north of Linden. And many of the people who later were very important and instrumental in the development of agriculture in Palestine, and later the early state of Israel, were trained in Alem. While Moritz Simon had this desire to change the view of Jews in Germany and in Hanover, and to move away from traditional trades or traditional professions such as banking or retailing, it nevertheless remains a fact that retailing, for instance, in Hanover, was strongly influenced by Jewish entrepreneurs from the locality. Hanover city centre developed towards the railway station from the mid-19th century, because the railway station was a motor of change. It brought consumers into the city, it brought goods into the city, and the city gradually developed away from the core of the city centre around the palace and the market church towards the railway station. And if you look at this map, you might expect a broad street like Karmarstraße to become the main shopping street. If you can see, it connects the old historic city core quite directly with the railway station. But this was in fact not the case, because Karmarstraße was only built after two very small, narrow medieval streets had already developed into main shopping streets. And two-thirds of the businesses on this street that led the way into modern retailing were Jewish owned. And if we take the example of department stores as the biggest and most modern sort of retailing in 19th century Europe, you will see that of the 6 department stores in the city centre of Hanover, 4 of them were Jewish owned. Selzer was not Jewish. Molling was the brother of Adolf Molling, the printing works Molling, founded a department store on this corner of Osterstraße, Salwinderstraße in 1862. Next door, Sternheim and Emanuel followed with a department store. Across the road, Elsbach and Frank. Just down the street, Bormas. And around the corner, on the city's biggest shopping street, Georgstraße, the national chain Karstadt also opened a building. But 4 of these innovative buildings or innovative businesses were run by Jewish families and Jewish entrepreneurs. In what ways were they innovative? To understand why department stores made such a splash on 19th century retailing, you have to understand that the shops beforehand were small, dark, goods were not priced visibly. So an individual entering the shop had to enter into a conversation with the salesperson to find out if they could afford to pay for what was on display. And prices were not fixed, so you had to negotiate. And this was something that put shy people off shopping and pushed people with less money off shopping. And department stores, through bulk buying and bulk selling, were able firstly to reduce their prices. Secondly, they offered goods in a range of prices. So if you were looking for stockings, you could get stockings perhaps for 20 Pfennig, or you could get stockings for 3 or 4 marks, and everything in between. So there was something for everybody, and they advertised like that. And the most important thing was that prices were fixed and were clearly labeled. So you could go in, look around, and if you couldn't afford anything, you didn't lose face, you could simply walk out again. You didn't have to talk to anybody, you didn't have to engage in any maybe embarrassing negotiations. Another aspect of the department stores that made them so successful was their innovative advertising schemes. They advertised on everything. It might be not terribly surprising to see advertising on a postcard, even though it is rather surprising to see a Jewish-owned department store providing Easter cards for the Christian market. It's perhaps a little more surprising to see tram tickets with department store advertising on the back. They also provided special activities, special offers, not dissimilar to the sort of things we're used to today. All of this advertising is Sternheim and Emanuel, and this newspaper advertisement advertised that Thursdays and Fridays are children's days. It doesn't mean that children can go to shop in the store, but it means that anybody who brings a child gets given a present for that child. The advertising here says that the child gets a balloon for free. That mightn't draw people nowadays, but it certainly seems to have in the 1920s. Another typical giveaway were little picture books, again here from Sternheim and Emanuel in Hanover. And many of the big department stores organized fashion shows and advertised them in the newspapers, advertised them with flyers, and tried to promote their department stores as places of couture, places of culture, places where you could go and have a nice time, meet each other. And many of the department stores also had cafes, so that after shopping or after enjoying a fashion show, you could go and have Kaffee and Kuchen in typical German style. We're going to look at the buildings of two of the Jewish department stores in Hanover. Bormas was the first one to have a purpose-built department store in 1899. This is a view I discovered of the interior, which hasn't been shown before, except in my previous stroll through Jewish Hannover. So you're the second audience to see this. You can see a very imposing 19th century building with lots of fancy ironwork on the staircase that goes through the whole building. And here the historic photograph is unfortunately not terribly good, but you can get the idea that there's probably some sort of plaster relief decorating the top part of the building. Molling, down the road, also built a new department store in 1903. They were completely in the throes of Art Nouveau style at that stage. And you can see that their central stairwell is very much in the Art Nouveau manner. Here again, close-up view. These very palatial buildings, unfortunately, were almost completely destroyed in the Second World War, so that they only live on in a few photographs and in many people's memories. I've already mentioned numerous very well-known people who were very active in Hanover. Hanover also likes to claim two very famous Jewish people who were only born in the city but didn't actually live there. Otto Meyerhoff, Nobel Prize winner, was born in Hanover in 1884, but he grew up in Berlin and he won the Nobel Prize in biochemistry. Hannah Arendt, who's featuring in reports again at the moment because it's the 60th anniversary of the Eichmann trial, and her reports on the Eichmann trial were very famous at the time and are still widely read. Hannah Arendt was born in the village of Linden in 1906, but her parents moved to Königsberg, taking her with them when she was only 3 years old. But both of these people have streets named after them in Hanover, and the city is proud of residents who were only resident as small children, but likes to remember that they were born here. Another prominent Hanoverian who is probably less well known outside of the city is Professor Theodor Lessing, who was a professor of philosophy in the University of Hanover in the 19th century. His non-Jewish wife, Ada Lessing, was a communist and founded the first adult education college or community college in Hanover. And Theodor Lessing assisted her with the running of this college, which was located, here's the university where Theodor worked, and the community college was in the city center. After the war, it was relocated a block down, and my workplace at Zeitzentrum Zivilcourage, which is an educational center for Holocaust education in Hanover, is now located on the site of that community college. So we have a close link with Theodor Lessing, and the street that we're located on is now called Theodor Lessing Platz. So it's a name that I write very frequently. And the modern community college in Hanover is located a little bit closer into the city center and is now called after Theodor Lessing and his wife Ada. It's known as the Theodor and Ada Lessing Volkshochschule. So another Jewish Hanoverian whose name is used daily by many people in the city. You can see that we're on a very different scale by the 1920s, a city that is spreading out into the countryside. I had to use a modern map to show my next aspect of the expansion of the Jewish community in the 1920s, because none of the 1920s maps extend far enough to show where the new cemetery was built in 1924, here with the mourning hall from the 50s, from the post-war period. And a very important building in architectural terms and in social terms for the city was the Heinemannhof, founded by Danny Heinemann, who was an American Jew whose parents came from Hanover, and he created a foundation named after his parents, the Minna James Heinemann Foundation, in 1928. And one of the first things he did with this foundation was to build a care home for elderly, genteel Jewish ladies in Hanover. The building was taken over by the city during the war. It was returned to the Heinemann Foundation after the war. The foundation then sold it back to the city for a fair price this time, and it is again an old people's home. We've talked a lot about the religious community, we've talked about industry, but not a lot about culture and the arts, which I promised you at the beginning. There's a very interesting aspect of Jewish participation in culture and the arts in Hanover is the Women's Art Association, GEDOC, which was set up, a branch of which was set up in Hanover in the 1920s. They met in the city centre on the Georgsplatz, and one of the important cultural and social centres of the GEDOC movement in Hanover was the home of Käthe Steinitz, a Jewish doctor's wife who lived across the road from the women's club where the exhibitions of the GEDOC Association were held. And Käthe Steinitz was born in Upper Silesia. She married Dr. Ernst Steinitz and followed him to Hanover. She had been a student of Käthe Kollwitz and Lovitz Corinth, so she had her own artistic ambitions. But as a wife and mother, she had less opportunity to work as an artist, but she didn't waste time and didn't submit to her fate as a wife and mother. She wrote in her later in an autobiographical account of her friendship with Kurt Schwitters, the artist Kurt Schwitters. She wrote, "Just as soon as we settled into our new surroundings, I began to seek out spots of color in grey Hanover." She wasn't very impressed by Hanover when she first arrived, but she soon managed to find spots of color. One of these spots of color was in the GEDOC Association, where she met many other women with artistic interests and women who lived from their art, and a surprisingly high number of these women were Jewish. Käthe and Ernst Steinitz had a sort of salon in their apartment, and among the people who regularly visited this salon was the Dadaist artist Kurt Schwitters from Hanover. And together with Kurt Schwitters, Käthe Steinitz wrote these Märchen vom Paradies, or Paradise fairy tales, which they printed themselves in Molling's printing works. And a famous artifact from Käthe Steinitz's salon is the guest book, which is now in the collection of the Sprenger Museum. And here you can see a page dedicated to Käthe Steinitz and her family by Kurt Schwitters from the guest book. Ernst Steinitz, Dr. Ernst Steinitz, was no longer able to practice fully as a doctor in the 1930s as a Jew, and he and Käthe and their daughters fled to the United States and lived out their lives in America. I want this lecture to be about the positive aspects of Jewish life in Hanover and about the things that Jewish Hanoverians contributed to their city, but you can't talk about Jewish life in Germany without some mention of the 1930s, of the persecution of Jews in Germany and in Hanover by the National Socialists, by the Nazis, and the central symbolic element of persecution, particularly in the memory of many people who survived, was the burning of the synagogue on Kristallnacht, the Pogromnacht, the night of the pogroms, on the 9th and 10th of November 1938. Many of you may know that the pogrom was allegedly caused by the acts of Herschel Grünspan or Hermann Grünspan, who shot Ernst vom Rath in the German embassy in Paris a few days before the pogrom. The Nazis used this deed. Here's a headline from a Hanoverian newspaper. implying that, or with a linguistically very negative reporting about Herschel's deed, referring to him as a Jewish murdering boy, or a murdering Jewish boy. He was condemned before any trial in the press. What many of you may not know is that Hermann Grünspan, or Herzl Greenspan, depending on which version of his name you use, was a young man from Hanover. He was born in the city center to Polish parents of Polish origin, and he had emigrated to Paris, was hoping to help his family to emigrate as well, and was plunged into despair when he heard that his parents and his siblings had been deported from Hanover to the Polish border in October 1938 in the course of the so-called Polish Action, whereby Jews of Polish citizenship were expelled from Germany. And in response to this tragic event in his family, he bought a revolver and went to the German embassy to make some sort of a sign. And he shot at Secretary Ernst vom Rath, who died of his wounds 2 days later. And in Germany, the Nazi propaganda machine was set in motion, claiming that the people of Germany went on the streets in protest at this action and carried out the deeds that later became known as Crystal Night or the Reichspogromnacht, when in fact these lootings, burnings, pillagings, arrests of Jewish men, mostly men, 1 or 2 women, were all organized and carried out by members of Nazi organizations and not by ordinary members of the public. And here we see Hanover's beautiful, imposing synagogue in the city center just being left to burn after being set on fire by SA men during the night, and the fire brigade just stood by and watched the building burn. And for many people, this is the symbol of the end of Jewish life in Hanover. I would just like to take a brief look back at some of the more prominent and well-known rabbis of Hanover, of what people in 1945 thought would probably be a vanished community. Dr. Nathan Markus Adler, in the 19th century, Samuel Ephraim Meyer, also 19th century, Selig Gronemann, early 20th century, Dr. Samuel Freund, who's remembered in the city because his name is perpetuated in the Freund Allee or Freund Avenue, just around the corner from Hanover's new synagogue. And Dr. Emil Schorsch. Ismar Schorsch is going to be a guest of Begegnung Christen und Juden in November, and we look forward very much to seeing him and hearing from him then. His father, Emil Schorsch, was the last rabbi of Hanover before the war. What do we have left in the city in 1945? Most of the remaining Jewish Hanoverians who didn't emigrate or were not able to emigrate in the 1930s were deported to the camps. They were deported to Riga, to Theresienstadt, to Warsaw, to Warsaw, and to Auschwitz, and very few returned from the camps. About 100 Jewish Hanoverians were still alive in the city at the end of the war. And those people and the few returnees from the camps immediately set about setting up aid organizations. The first in the Oberstrasse, where the Teachers College had been, that I showed you in an earlier slide. Here we see a card or an piece of ID issued to Michael Fürst, to Michael Fürst's father Helmut Fürst, a returning Jew from Hanover who returned from Riga. Here we see a card issued by the Jewish committee in the Oberstrasse, entitling him, for instance, to get some financial aid and to be supplied with food and clothing. Another Jewish organization on the Theodor Lessingplatz, just outside the former community college. Again, an ID card issued from there to Helmut Fürst, Michael Fürst's father, for clothing and other assistance, was the concentration camp committee, the so-called camp committee or CC. And both of these organizations attempted to assist the people who were coming into the city released from camps, perhaps many of them looking to go to Israel or to go to the US or to go to Great Britain in the hope of meeting up with surviving family members. Some of them, like Helmut Fürst, shown on these IDs, stayed in Hanover. Some of the committee members stayed in Hanover and began to build up a new Jewish community. In 1963, a new synagogue was opened in Hanover for the first time on Heckelstraße, just around the corner from Freundallee. This community grew rapidly after the 1990s, when Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union began to come into Germany, and today it has 4,500 members, nearly as many as the entire Jewish community before the war. And its chair since 2006 is Michael Fürst, whose father's picture was shown on the previous slide. In 1995, a breakout group from the main synagogue founded a liberal congregation, and they built or converted a Christian church, a deconsecrated Christian church, into a new synagogue, Etz Chaim, the Tree of Life in Stöcken. And this community today has 800 members. So we're up to over 5,000. And it's led by or chaired by Rebecca Seidler. In 1997, Bukharian Sephardic families from the former Soviet Union began to settle in Hanover, and they formed their own community. In 2011, they purchased a former Christian church, which they transformed into the first blue synagogue in Western Europe, and that was consecrated in 2013. And this smaller community has more than 300 members. In 2005, the Chabad movement, Chabad Lubavitch, it's a Hasidic Orthodox movement, which some of you may be familiar with, was founded by Rabbi Benjamin Wolf in Krefeld, to the east of the city center. And this year, they opened a new synagogue and religious center in a former railway station in the old Bismarck railway station, and called it Haus Benjamin, after Benjamin Wolf, who died last year. And the congregation is headed by Sterner Wolf. Unusually for a Hasidic Orthodox congregation, it has a female head. And since 2007, the Chabad Lubavitch movement has hosted a public Hanukkah ceremony on the Opera Square in the center of Hanover, which is attended by members of all congregations. And there is a public lighting of the first candle on the menorah by the head of the Hasidic community and the current mayor of the city. And our current mayor happens to be a Muslim, so that it's truly an interreligious ceremony, very public, very visible in the city center. So how can you summarize Jewish life in Hanover today? It's very widespread, it's very vibrant, it's very varied. And on this last slide, I'll show you aspects of continuity from historic Jewish life and the blossoming of new Jewish life in the city on the map. First dot, I need my script for this because I can't remember this off by heart, there's a lot of dots. The first dot shows the old cemetery, the oldest Jewish institution in Hanover, opened in around 1550 and still there today. The second dot shows the new cemetery, opened in 1864 and still there today, undamaged. The third dot shows the horticultural school in Aalen, which is still present in parts today, but with a very different use. It has been a memorial for Jewish life in Hanover since the 1980s. The Jewish hospital on Ellandstraße is still there as a building, but it is now private apartments. It's no longer a center of Jewish life. The Villa Seligman, built by the maker of Continental, is still there, and it is filled with new, vibrant Jewish life in the form of the European Center for Jewish Music. New institutions, such as, we're still with historic institutions. The new cemetery in Bothfeld is still there and is very much in use. The new synagogue and the new old people's home built in the 1960s in the Heckelstraße are still very much there, very lively and active congregation. The liberal synagogue in Stöcken, the Chabad Lubavitch, House Benjamin in the south part of the city. Sorry, I've made a jump here. That was the Sephardic community, the Hasidic community, the synagogue choir, sorry, I'm mixing my languages. And some important parts of Jewish heritage are no longer present, but are marked by memorials. The site of the burnt down synagogue is now the site of a small memorial to that synagogue. The site of the teacher training college and the Jewish kindergarten is marked by a memorial that was created in cooperation with students of the schools that are now located there. In the heart of the city, beside the Opera House, is the memorial for the Jews of Hanover murdered in the Holocaust, and the empty circle, the red circle, marks the Jewish school in the Litzowstraße, which is no longer present and is now the site of a multi-story car park. At the beginning of this year, when Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, was interviewed concerning the year-long celebrations of 1700 years of Jewish life in Germany, among other things, she said that the 1700 years of Jewish life in Germany are now one thing above all, a history with a future. And I think that this sort of gallop through the history of Hanover's Jewish congregation and Jewish community and Jewish life shows us that we are now in quite a good position in Hanover in terms of Jewish life. There are 4 vibrant communities. They are all growing. There is a vibrant Jewish cultural life, and I'd like to finish with the hope that this will continue to grow and to prosper, and that the visible signs of Jewish life will become more and more confident, and that perhaps one day we might reach a stage where synagogues and Jewish kindergartens and other Jewish institutions in German towns and cities do not need to have a police presence outside them. Thank you very much.